It was just another ordinary day in the city, where life moved at its usual pace, cars honking, people rushing, and the hum of daily routines filling the air. Amidst the hustle and bustle, a pregnant woman named Lisa sat quietly in her wheelchair outside a local grocery store. Her face radiated both strength and vulnerability, a mix of emotions that seemed to echo her journey through life. She was waiting for her husband, Michael, to return with some groceries. The two had recently moved to the area, hoping for a fresh start before their baby arrived. But little did Lisa know, this ordinary day was about to take a turn that no one could have anticipated. Michael, a calm and composed man, wasn't just any husband. He worked as an undercover FBI agent, trained to handle the most intense situations. But today, he wasn't on duty, at least not officially. Dressed in casual clothes, he blended into the crowd like any other civilian, his professional life kept carefully under wraps. For him, protecting his family was just as important as protecting the nation. And as he picked out items from the store shelves, his thoughts were filled with excitement about becoming a father. He couldn't wait to surprise Lisa with her favorite snacks, something to make her smile. Outside, Lisa adjusted herself in the wheelchair, her hand resting gently on her growing belly. The world around her moved as usual, but she suddenly noticed a police officer walking toward her. At first, she didn't think much of it. Police officers were a common sight in the area. But something about his expression made her uneasy. He seemed tense, his eyes scanning her with a mix of suspicion and authority. Lisa sat up straighter, trying to brush off the feeling. Surely, there was no reason for concern. "Ma'am," the officer said, his voice sharp and commanding, "what are you doing here?" Startled, Lisa replied politely, "I'm just waiting for my husband. He's inside the store." But the officer didn't seem satisfied with her answer. His tone grew firmer as he questioned her further, his words laced with accusations. "Are you sure you're not causing any trouble? This area's been having problems lately." Lisa was taken aback. What trouble could she possibly cause, sitting in her wheelchair, visibly pregnant? She tried to remain calm, explaining again that she was simply waiting for her husband. But the officer's demeanor didn't change. Instead, he demanded to see her ID, his voice growing louder with each word. The scene began to attract attention. Passers-by slowed their steps, curious and concerned about what was happening. Lisa's heart raced as she fumbled to reach for her bag, her hands trembling. She had done nothing wrong, yet she felt the weight of suspicion pressing down on her. And then, without warning, the officer's actions escalated. He accused her of resisting and attempted to forcefully remove her from the wheelchair. Lisa cried out, pleading for him to stop, but her words seemed to fall on deaf ears. The situation spiraled out of control in an instant. Inside the store, Michael was at the checkout counter when he heard the commotion outside. His instincts kicked in immediately. Something wasn't right. Dropping the items he was holding, he rushed to the door, his heart pounding in his chest. As he stepped outside, the scene before him left him frozen for a split second. There was Lisa, his wife, being confronted by a uniformed officer, her face filled with fear and pain. Michael's years of training had prepared him for high-stakes situations, but this was different. This wasn't just a stranger in need, it was his family. Without revealing his identity, he began to approach the scene, carefully observing every detail. His mind raced with questions. What had led to this? Why was the officer acting so aggressively toward his pregnant wife? The tension in the air was palpable as Michael closed the distance. He could feel the stares of the crowd, their murmurs filling the background like static noise. But all he could focus on was Lisa, who looked at him with a mixture of relief and desperation. She didn't know what he would do or how he would handle this, but she trusted him completely. As Michael reached the edge of the scene, he called out to the officer, his voice calm but firm. "Excuse me, officer. What's going on here?" The officer turned to face him, his expression unreadable. "Stay out of this," he snapped. "This doesn't concern you." Michael took a deep breath, his calm demeanor masking the storm brewing inside him. He couldn't afford to reveal who he was just yet, not until he fully understood the situation. But one thing was certain, he wasn't going to stand by and let this happen. The crowd watched in silence, their eyes darting between the officer, the pregnant woman, and the man who had just arrived. The atmosphere was charged with anticipation, as if everyone was holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. And that's where the story begins to unravel, a moment frozen in time, filled with unanswered questions and unresolved tension. How will Michael handle this confrontation? What will happen when the officer learns the truth about who he is? And most importantly, will justice be served before it's too late? Stay tuned, because this is a story you won't want to miss. This introduction sets the stage for a gripping and emotional story, leaving the audience eager to find out what happens next. Michael didn't move, standing firm as he locked eyes with the officer. Despite the chaos bubbling inside him, he maintained a calm exterior. Years of training had taught him that emotions could cloud judgment, and right now he needed his focus. Lisa's safety depended on it. The officer, seemingly emboldened by the crowd's hesitation to intervene, barked again. "Sir, I told you to step back. This is official police business." Michael's gaze shifted briefly to Lisa, who looked shaken but was still trying to compose herself. He could see the fear in her eyes, but also something more, an unspoken plea for him to handle this without escalating the situation further. Lisa was the kind of person who believed in doing the right thing, even when faced with adversity. She didn't want trouble, she just wanted to go home with her husband and prepare for the arrival of their child. But trouble had found her anyway. Taking a slow step forward, Michael spoke again, his tone even but firm. "Officer, that's my wife. She's pregnant, and she hasn't done anything wrong. I'm asking you to take a step back and let's talk this through." The officer's expression hardened. "Your wife? Then maybe you should have kept her out of public spaces if you didn't want any trouble. Now, step back, or I'll have you detained as well." The crowd murmured louder, the tension palpable. People were pulling out their phones, recording the scene, whispering among themselves. Some looked sympathetic, others hesitant to get involved. Michael could feel the weight of every second passing. He clenched his jaw, but didn't respond to the officer's provocation. Instead, he glanced around, quickly assessing his surroundings, noting the exits, the positions of bystanders, and even the officer's body language. Every detail mattered. Lisa, meanwhile, took a deep breath and tried to steady her voice. "Please, officer," she said, her words trembling but clear. "I haven't done anything. I was just sitting here, waiting for my husband. I don't understand why this is happening." The officer didn't seem to care. His hand hovered near his belt, where his taser was holstered, and Michael's stomach churned. He knew how these situations could spiral out of control in an instant, and he wasn't about to let that happen. But he also knew that revealing his identity as an FBI agent could complicate things. There were protocols to follow, and he didn't want to escalate the situation by pulling rank unless absolutely necessary. "Listen," Michael said, his voice calm but with an edge of authority. "I understand you have a job to do, but you're making a mistake. My wife hasn't broken any laws, and this is going too far. I suggest we step aside and talk this through before this gets worse." The officer hesitated for a split second, his eyes narrowing as he studied Michael. There was something about the man's calm demeanor that seemed out of place, something that didn't quite add up. But instead of backing down, the officer doubled down. "I don't take orders from you," he snapped. "And if you don't move back right now, I'll have you both detained for obstructing an investigation." Michael's patience was wearing thin, but he kept his composure. He couldn't let this situation escalate into something neither of them could come back from. He glanced at Lisa again, silently reassuring her that he was handling it. She nodded faintly, though her hands gripped the armrests of her wheelchair tightly. Meanwhile, the crowd grew larger, and the murmurs turned into louder whispers. "Why's he being so rough with her?" one man asked. "She's pregnant, for crying out loud," another woman said, shaking her head. The officer seemed aware of the growing scrutiny, but didn't waver. If anything, he looked more determined to assert his authority. And then something unexpected happened. From the edge of the crowd, a man stepped forward. He was older, maybe in his 60s, with a kind face and a calm demeanor. He raised his hands slightly, as if to show he wasn't a threat. "Officer," he said, his voice steady but firm, "I think we all just want to understand what's going on here. Maybe it's a misunderstanding." The officer shot the man an irritated glance but didn't respond. Instead, he turned his attention back to Michael and Lisa. "Last warning," he said, his tone cold. "Step back, or I'll be forced to take action." Michael's mind raced. He knew the situation was a powder keg, one wrong move away from exploding. He needed to defuse it, and fast. But how? Revealing his identity as an FBI agent might stop the officer in his tracks, but it could also backfire, especially if the officer felt embarrassed or cornered. Michael had seen it happen before. People in positions of power sometimes reacted unpredictably when their authority was challenged. Before he could decide his next move, a loud voice broke through the tension. "What's going on here?" It was another police officer, this one older and more composed, walking briskly toward the scene. His badge identified him as a sergeant, and his presence immediately shifted the energy. The younger officer straightened up, though he still looked defensive. "Sergeant," the younger officer began, "this woman was acting suspiciously and—" The sergeant held up a hand, silencing him. He turned to Michael and Lisa, his expression neutral but curious. "Can someone explain what's happening?" Michael saw this as his chance. "That's my wife," he said calmly. "She's pregnant and sitting in her wheelchair, waiting for me while I was inside the store." This officer approached her, questioned her aggressively, and it's escalated to this. "We haven't done anything wrong." The sergeant looked at Lisa, then back at the younger officer. "Is that true?" he asked, his tone firm. The younger officer hesitated, clearly flustered. "She was sitting here, acting suspiciously. I was just doing my job." The sergeant sighed, rubbing his temple. "And how exactly was she acting suspiciously?" The younger officer fumbled for an answer but didn't have one. The sergeant turned back to Michael and Lisa. "I apologize for the misunderstanding," he said. "I'll handle this." Then, addressing the younger officer, he added, "Come with me." As the two officers stepped aside, the crowd began to disperse, the tension easing slightly. But for Michael and Lisa, the moment wasn't over. Lisa looked up at her husband, her eyes filled with tears. "Thank you," she whispered. Michael crouched down beside her, his hand on hers. "It's not over yet," he said softly. "But I promise, I won't let anything happen to you or our baby." As the sergeant spoke quietly with the younger officer in the background, Michael's mind was still racing. Something about the situation didn't sit right with him. Was this just a case of overzealous policing, or was there more to it? And if so, what did it mean for his family? The answers were unclear, but one thing was certain: this was far from the end of the story. Underscore 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 underscore. This continuation builds more suspense while adding layers to the conflict and characters, keeping the audience engaged and eager for the next part of the story. Michael remained crouched beside Lisa, his hand steady on hers, but his mind was working overtime. The situation had de-escalated for now, but something about the younger officer's behavior gnawed at him. It wasn't just the aggression or the quick escalation, it was the look in the officer's eyes. It wasn't just about asserting authority. There was something else, something deeper. Michael's instincts, honed by years in the FBI, told him this wasn't a random encounter. Lisa squeezed his hand, breaking him out of his thoughts. "Michael," she whispered, her voice trembling, What if he comes back? What if this isn't over?" He looked at her, his expression softening. "It's over for now," he said, trying to sound reassuring. "But I'll make sure it doesn't happen again." He glanced toward the sergeant, who was still speaking quietly to the younger officer, his face a mix of sternness and disappointment. Michael could only hope the sergeant would handle things properly, but he knew better than to rely on hope alone. The crowd had mostly dispersed, though a few people lingered at a distance, their phones still in hand, their eyes darting between Lisa, Michael, and the officers. Michael couldn't blame them. In today's world, people recorded everything. Sometimes it made things better. Other times, it just added fuel to the fire. Either way, he knew those videos might come in handy if this situation escalated further. The sergeant finally dismissed the younger officer, who walked away stiffly, his face flushed with anger or embarrassment, or maybe both. The sergeant approached Michael and Lisa, his posture apologetic but professional. "I'm sorry for the misunderstanding," he said, his tone measured. "I've spoken to the officer, and he'll be reminded about the importance of proper conduct. Are you both okay?" Michael straightened, his eyes scanning the sergeant's face for any sign of insincerity. "We'll be fine," he replied, though his tone carried a weight that suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. "But this shouldn't have happened in the first place. My wife did nothing wrong. She's pregnant, for God's sake." The sergeant nodded, his expression serious. "You're right, it shouldn't have happened. I'll make sure it doesn't happen again. If you'd like to file a formal complaint, I can assist you with that." Michael considered it for a moment. Filing a complaint might be the right thing to do, but it also risked drawing more attention to their family, a risk he wasn't sure he wanted to take, especially with Lisa's pregnancy and his undercover work. "I'll think about it," he said finally. The sergeant nodded again, handing Michael a business card. "If you need anything, call me. And again, I'm sorry for what happened." Michael slipped the card into his pocket, his expression unreadable. As the sergeant walked away, Lisa let out a shaky breath. "Can we go home now?" she asked softly. Michael nodded, his jaw tightening. "Yeah, let's go home." But as he wheeled Lisa toward their car, his mind was already racing with questions. Why had the younger officer been so aggressive? Was it just a case of overzealous policing, or was there more to it? Michael couldn't shake the feeling that they'd been singled out for a reason. And if that was true, then the question was, why? Later that evening, as Lisa rested on the couch with a blanket draped over her, Michael sat at the kitchen table, his laptop open in front of him. The house was quiet except for the faint hum of the refrigerator, but his mind was anything but still. He'd spent the past hour researching the younger officer, cross-referencing his name with internal law enforcement databases and public records. What he found wasn't exactly surprising, but was troubling nonetheless. The officer, whose name was Ryan Blake, had a history of complaints filed against him, mostly for excessive force and misconduct. None of the complaints had gone anywhere, though, and Blake remained on active duty. Michael frowned as he scrolled through the records. This wasn't the first time Blake had crossed the line, and it likely wouldn't be the last. But something else caught Michael's attention. Buried within the records was a small, seemingly insignificant detail. Blake had recently transferred to this precinct from a neighboring city. The transfer had been sudden and unexplained, raising red flags in Michael's mind. Transfers like that often signaled trouble, an officer being quietly moved to avoid public scrutiny. Michael leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed. This wasn't just about today's incident. There was more to this story, and he needed to figure out what it was. But before he could dive deeper, Lisa's voice interrupted his thoughts. "Michael," she called softly, "what are you doing?" He closed the laptop and walked over to her, sitting down on the edge of the couch. "Just looking into a few things," he said, his tone careful. "How are you feeling?" Lisa gave him a tired smile. "Better, I think. But I can't stop thinking about what happened. Why was he so angry? I didn't do anything." Michael reached for her hand, his thumb brushing against hers. "I don't know yet," he admitted, "but I'm going to find out, I promise." Lisa nodded, though her expression remained uncertain. Just be careful, okay? I don't want anything to happen to you." Michael smiled, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Nothing's going to happen to me," he said. "You and the baby, that's all that matters." As Lisa drifted off to sleep, Michael returned to the kitchen, his resolve strengthening with every passing moment. This wasn't just about what had happened to Lisa today. It was about preventing it from happening to anyone else. And if Officer Blake thought he could get away with it, he was about to learn how wrong he was. Michael's next move would be critical. He needed to dig deeper into Blake's history, figure out what had prompted the transfer, and uncover any patterns that might explain his behavior. But he also needed to be careful. His work with the FBI required discretion, and if he wasn't careful, his investigation could jeopardize not only his career, but also his family's safety. The pieces of the puzzle were slowly coming together, but the picture they formed was far from complete. And as Michael delved deeper, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something much bigger, something that would test him in ways he hadn't been tested before. For now, though, all he could do was take it one step at a time, knowing that the truth was out there, waiting to be uncovered. The next morning, Michael woke up with a renewed sense of determination. Lisa was still asleep, her breathing soft and steady, and he took a moment to watch her, his heart heavy with both love and worry. She deserved peace, safety, and a world where her kindness wasn't met with hostility. He couldn't let what had happened slide, not when there were so many unanswered questions. As quietly as he could, Michael slipped out of bed and made his way to the kitchen, where his laptop waited for him. The information he gathered last night was troubling, but it wasn't enough. He needed more, something concrete that could explain Officer Blake's behavior or, at the very least, hold him accountable. Michael's fingers flew across the keyboard as he accessed law enforcement databases, cross-referenced public complaints, and dug into old news articles. The deeper he went, the more unsettling the picture became. Officer Blake wasn't just overzealous. He had a pattern of targeting individuals who were vulnerable, those who couldn't fight back. There were reports of him harassing teenagers, roughing up people experiencing homelessness, and even intimidating witnesses. But something else stood out. Buried in the records was a name that Michael recognized: Victor Morales. Victor was a known criminal, a mid-level player in a local gang that specialized in trafficking. Michael had come across his name during an unrelated FBI case months ago, but nothing had come of it. Now, it seemed that Victor and Officer Blake might have a connection. Michael leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. If Blake was working with Victor, or worse, for him, it would explain a lot. It would explain the aggression, the sudden transfer, and even why Blake had targeted Lisa. But it also raised more questions. Why Lisa? What did Victor, or Blake, stand to gain? The sound of Lisa stirring pulled Michael out of his thoughts. He quickly closed his laptop as she shuffled into the kitchen, rubbing her eyes and looking more rested than she had the night before. "Good morning," she said, her voice soft but warm. "Good morning," Michael replied, standing to pour her a glass of water. "How are you feeling?" "Better," she said, taking the glass from him, but still a little shaken. Michael nodded, his expression serious. "I'm going to make sure we get to the bottom of this," he said. "But I need you to trust me, okay?" Lisa frowned but nodded. "I trust you," she said. "I just don't want you to get too involved. It's dangerous." Michael smiled, though his eyes remained serious. "I'll be careful," he promised. Later that day, Michael decided it was time to dig deeper into Victor Morales. He couldn't do it from home, not without risking someone tracking his searches, so he went to the FBI field office under the guise of checking in on an old case. Once there, he accessed the secure database and pulled up everything he could find on Victor. What he found sent a chill down his spine. Victor wasn't just a mid-level player. He was rising quickly through the ranks, and his gang's operations were expanding. More troubling, there were whispers that Victor had connections within law enforcement, people who helped him avoid arrests and tipped him off about investigations. Michael's gut told him Officer Blake was one of those connections. But if that was true, Then it meant Blake had a reason for targeting Lisa. Maybe she'd been mistaken for someone else, or maybe it was a warning, though Michael couldn't imagine why Victor would see his family as a threat. Michael's thoughts were interrupted by a colleague, Agent Ramirez, who gave him a curious look. "You're not assigned to Morales, are you?" Ramirez asked, glancing at the file on Michael's screen. "Not officially," Michael said, keeping his tone casual. "But something came up, and I thought I'd take a look." Ramirez raised an eyebrow, but didn't press further. "Be careful with that one," he said. "Morales has friends in high places. You don't want to poke the bear unless you're ready for a fight." Michael nodded, filing the warning away. As much as he hated to admit it, Ramirez was right. If Morales was connected to Blake, and by extension, to what happened to Lisa, then Michael was walking a fine line. That evening, as Michael shared a quiet dinner with Lisa, he couldn't help but feel the weight of the day's discoveries pressing down on him. He hadn't told her everything, didn't want to worry her more than she already was. But the secrets were beginning to feel like a heavy burden. Lisa seemed to sense his tension. "Michael," she said gently, "you've been distant all day. Is everything okay?" He looked at her, debating whether to tell her the truth. Finally, he decided she deserved to know, at least part of it. "I think the officer who attacked you might be connected to something bigger," he said carefully, "but I'm still figuring it out." Lisa's eyes widened. "Bigger? What do you mean?" "I'm not sure yet," Michael admitted, "but I promise I'll keep you safe, no matter what." Lisa nodded, though her worry was evident. "Just don't do anything reckless," she said. "I need you here, with me and the baby." Michael reached across the table, taking her hand in his. "I'll be careful," he said again. "I promise." But as the night wore on, Michael's mind refused to rest. He knew he was close to uncovering the truth, but the closer he got, the more dangerous it became. And as much as he hated to admit it, he couldn't do this alone. He needed help, someone he could trust. The next morning, Michael made a call to an old friend, someone who had worked with him on several high-profile cases in the past. Agent Caroline Bennett was sharp, resourceful, and fiercely loyal, exactly the kind of person Michael needed on his side. When Caroline answered, her tone was warm but curious. "Michael, it's been a while. What's going on?" "I need your help," he said, wasting no time. "It's personal, and it's urgent." There was a brief pause before Caroline replied, her voice steady. "Tell me everything." As Michael explained the situation, Caroline listened carefully, occasionally asking questions, but mostly letting him talk. By the time he finished, she was silent for a moment, processing what he'd said. "This is big, Michael," she said finally. "If Blake and Morales are connected, then you're looking at corruption that could go all the way up the chain." "I know," Michael said, "but I can't let it go, not after what happened to Lisa." Caroline's voice softened. "I get it," she said, "and I'm in. Whatever you need, I'll help." Michael felt a wave of relief, but it was tempered by the knowledge that this was only the beginning. The road ahead would be dangerous, and the stakes couldn't be higher. But with Caroline's help, he felt a glimmer of hope. As he hung up the phone, Michael glanced at Lisa, who was sitting on the couch, her hand resting on her belly. He couldn't let her down. He couldn't let their family be a target. But the closer he got to the truth, the more he realized just how deep the corruption ran, and how far some people would go to keep their secrets buried. Michael had barely set the phone down when his own buzzed with a notification. At first, he thought it might be Caroline following up, but when he checked, it wasn't a call or a message, it was an email. The sender was anonymous, the kind of account only used when someone didn't want to be traced. The subject line read, "You don't know what you're dealing with." His pulse quickened as he opened it. The email was short but chilling. "Walk away now. This isn't your fight. Keep digging, and you'll regret it." Attached to the email was a single photograph. It was of Lisa, taken from a distance, sitting on the porch just moments earlier. Michael felt the air leave his lungs as fear turned into rage. Someone was watching them. Someone was close enough to threaten his family, and they weren't afraid to let him know. He immediately closed the blinds and locked all the doors, his mind racing. Lisa, sensing the sudden shift in his demeanor, looked up from her spot on the couch. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice tinged with worry. "Nothing," Michael lied, forcing a calm he didn't feel. "Just work stuff." But Lisa wasn't convinced. She knew him too well. "Michael, don't shut me out," she said. "If something's going on, I need to know." He hesitated, torn between wanting to protect her and knowing she deserved the truth. Finally, he decided on a partial truth. "Someone doesn't want me looking into this," he admitted. "But I'm not going to stop. I can't." Lisa's face paled. Is it about what happened with that officer?" Michael nodded, his jaw tight. "I think it's bigger than him. There's a lot I still don't know, but I'll figure it out, I promise." That night, Michael barely slept. Every sound outside made him jump. Every shadow seemed suspicious. His instincts, honed by years in the FBI, told him this wasn't just a scare tactic. Whoever sent that email was serious. The next morning, he reached out to Caroline, sharing the email and the photograph. She was just as alarmed as he was. "They're watching you, Michael," she said. "You need to be careful. If they're this bold, it means they're desperate and dangerous." "I'm not backing down," Michael replied firmly. "But I need to know who sent this. Can you trace the email?" "I'll try," Caroline said. "But if they're smart, and it sounds like they are, they've probably covered their tracks." While Caroline worked on the email, Michael decided to dig deeper into Officer Blake. He needed to understand the connection between Blake and Victor Morales, and why they targeted Lisa. Using resources only available to someone with his clearance, Michael accessed internal police files, searching for anything that might tie the two men together. It didn't take long to find something. A financial audit revealed that Blake had recently come into a significant amount of money, far more than his salary could account for. The deposits were irregular and untraceable, the kind of thing only someone with something to hide would do. Michael's stomach sank as he read through the reports. Blake wasn't just corrupt, he was on Morales' payroll, but that still didn't explain why Lisa had been targeted. The answer came later that afternoon, in the form of a call from Caroline. Her voice was tense, the kind of tone she used when delivering bad news. "Michael, I traced the email as far as I could. It's bouncing through multiple servers, but I managed to narrow it down to a region. You're not going to like this." "Where?" Michael asked, already bracing himself. "It's coming from inside the department," Caroline said. "Someone on the inside is helping Morales, and they're keeping tabs on you." Michael's grip on the phone tightened. "So this isn't just about Blake," he said. "There's more." "There's always more," Caroline replied, "and I think you're starting to get too close to it." The realization hit Michael like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just about one rogue cop or one criminal. This was about a network, a system of corruption that ran deeper than he'd imagined. And now, he and Lisa were caught in the middle of it. But even as the stakes rose, Michael felt his resolve harden. If they thought they could scare him into backing down, they were wrong. He'd spent his career bringing people like this to justice, and he wasn't about to stop now. Still, the threats couldn't be ignored. That evening, Michael took extra precautions, setting up surveillance cameras around the house and ensuring Lisa's phone had a tracking app installed, just in case. He also made a plan with Caroline to meet in person the following day. They needed to strategize to figure out their next move. But as the night wore on, Michael couldn't shake the feeling that they were running out of time. The photograph, the email, it all felt like the prelude to something bigger, something darker. And he was right. Just before midnight, there was a knock at the door. Michael froze, every nerve in his body on high alert. Lisa, who had been dozing on the couch, stirred awake. "Who could that be?" she asked, her voice groggy. "Stay here," Michael said, moving toward the door. He checked the security feed on his phone, but the camera didn't show anyone standing outside. His heart pounded as he approached the door, his hand resting on the firearm he kept hidden in the console table. When he opened the door, no one was there, but lying on the porch was a small envelope, unmarked except for his name scrawled across the front. Michael picked it up cautiously, scanning the street for any sign of movement. The night was silent, the neighborhood still. He closed the door and brought the envelope inside, his mind racing. Inside was a single piece of paper, folded neatly. Written on it were just 4 words: "You've been warned. Stop." Michael stared at the note, his mind spinning. This wasn't just a threat. It was a declaration. Whoever was behind this wasn't just trying to scare him. They were making it clear that they were watching, that they had the upper hand. But they underestimated him, because now Michael was more determined than ever to uncover the truth, even if it meant risking everything. The air in the house was thick with tension as Michael stared at the cryptic note. He didn't know if it was the adrenaline or sheer determination driving him now, but the fear that had crept in earlier was gone. He wasn't going to let them win. With Lisa now aware of the severity of the situation, they both knew there was no turning back. She trusted Michael to handle things, but her concern was palpable. "Whatever you're planning," she whispered, "just promise me you'll be careful." The next morning, Michael met Caroline in a quiet, secluded diner outside town. She had news. Big news. "I cross-referenced Blake's financial records with Morales' known associates," she began, sliding a folder across the table. "And guess what? There's someone higher up pulling the strings, someone even dirtier than Morales." Michael opened the folder and froze. The face staring back at him was all too familiar. It was the chief of police, someone Michael had once worked with on community outreach projects. This was the last person he'd suspected. The betrayal felt personal. "It gets worse," Caroline continued. "The chief isn't just protecting Morales, he's actively involved in his operations. Money laundering, drug trafficking, you name it. And Blake was just one of his pawns." Michael's mind raced. This explained the email, the photo, the note. The chief had the resources and connections to orchestrate it all. But why target Lisa? What do they think she knew? "Lisa was just in the wrong place at the wrong time," Caroline said, as if reading his thoughts. "But now they see her as a liability. And you? You're the bigger threat. They're scared, Michael. That's why they're coming after you." Michael clenched his fists. "If they think threats are going to stop me, they're dead wrong." Caroline leaned closer. "You need to be smart about this. We don't have enough to take them down yet, but I have a plan." She outlined her idea, a sting operation to expose the chief and Morales. It was risky, but it was their best shot. Michael agreed, knowing the clock was ticking. That evening, Michael returned home to find Lisa waiting for him, a mixture of relief and worry on her face. He told her everything, about the chief, Morales, and the plan. "This ends soon," he promised. "But I need you to trust me." Lisa nodded, though her fear was evident. "Just come back to me," she said softly. The sting was set for the following night. Michael and Caroline coordinated with a small team of trusted agents, ensuring no leaks could compromise the operation. The plan was simple: lure Morales and the chief into a meeting under the guise of a lucrative deal, then catch them red-handed. When the night came, Michael's nerves were steely. Dressed in a wire and armed with evidence, he entered the abandoned warehouse where the meeting was set to take place. Morales arrived first, flanked by his men. He greeted Michael with a smirk, unaware of the trap being laid. Then came the chief. Seeing him in this context, laughing and shaking hands with Morales, was almost surreal. Michael played his part perfectly, acting as though he was there to broker a deal. But just as Caroline's signal came through to move in, something went wrong. One of Morales' men spotted the wire on Michael. Chaos erupted. Morales drew his gun, and the chief shouted orders, realizing they'd been set up. Michael dove for cover as shots rang out. The warehouse echoed with the sound of gunfire and shouts. Backup agents swarmed in, and within moments, Morales and his men were subdued. The chief, however, tried to escape. Michael chased him through the maze of corridors, adrenaline propelling him forward. When he finally cornered the chief, the man turned to face him, a look of desperation on his face. "You don't understand," he said. "I didn't have a choice. Morales had dirt on me, on my family. I had to protect them." Michael didn't waver. "And how many families did you destroy to save your own?" he shot back. The chief dropped his weapon, defeated. Moments later, agents arrived to take him into custody. The operation was a success. Back at home, Michael finally allowed himself to breathe. Lisa embraced him tightly, tears in her eyes. "It's over," she whispered. But just as they began to relax, Michael's phone buzzed with a new message. It was from another anonymous number. "You may have won this round," it read, "but it's far from over." Michael stared at the screen, a cold realization settling over him. While Morales and the chief were behind bars, the network they operated within was still out there. This wasn't the end, it was just the beginning. As he held Lisa close, Michael knew one thing for certain: he wasn't done fighting. Not until every last piece of the puzzle was uncovered. The battle had only just begun. Lisa came into the room, holding 2 steaming mugs of tea. She placed one in front of him and took a seat next to him on the couch. Her presence was grounding. She reached for his hand and gave it a gentle squeeze. "You've done everything you could, Michael. We're safe. That's what matters right now." Michael looked at her, a flicker of gratitude in his tired eyes. She was right. They had made it through. The thought of losing her, or their child, had been his greatest fear. Knowing they were here, with him, was enough to remind him of what he was fighting for. The days that followed were a whirlwind. Michael spent hours debriefing with his team, ensuring every piece of evidence against Morales and the chief was airtight. Caroline was relentless, combing through the data they had gathered to find any leads that could expose the broader network. The tension between them was replaced with a sense of camaraderie. They had gone through the fire together and come out stronger. Lisa, meanwhile, focused on her health and preparing for the arrival of their baby. She insisted on accompanying Michael to his follow-up security briefings, wanting to be informed and involved. Her strength amazed him. Despite everything she'd been through, she refused to let fear define her. Instead, she channeled her energy into creating a safe, loving environment for their growing family. The trial for Morales and the chief began months later. It was a media sensation, with headlines plastered across every major outlet. The testimony was harrowing. Witness after witness described the extent of their crimes, from corruption to trafficking and beyond. Michael took the stand, recounting his role in the sting operation and the threats made against him and Lisa. His words were measured, powerful, and left no room for doubt about the guilt of those involved. The courtroom was silent as the verdict was read. Guilty on all counts. Morales and the chief were sentenced to life in prison without parole. For the first time, Michael felt a sense of closure. Justice had been served, at least for now. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed him, shouting questions and snapping photos. Michael gave a brief statement, thanking his team, his family, and the community for their support. He didn't linger. There was nothing left to say. That night, back home, Michael and Lisa celebrated quietly. They didn't need grand gestures or loud celebrations. The peace of being together, free from immediate danger, was more than enough. Lisa leaned against Michael's shoulder as they sat on the porch, watching the stars. "Do you think it's really over?" she asked softly. Michael took a deep breath. "For now," he admitted, "but there's always going to be someone else out there. People like Morales don't operate in isolation. But as long as we stand together, we can handle whatever comes." Lisa smiled, her faith in him unwavering. "We've made it this far. We'll make it through anything." The weeks turned into months, and life began to settle into a new rhythm. Michael took a temporary leave from the FBI, wanting to focus on his family. Lisa gave birth to a healthy baby girl, whom they named Grace, a reminder of the strength and resilience they had found during the darkest of times. Michael's colleagues visited often, keeping him updated on the ongoing investigations into Morales' network. Caroline even became a regular presence at their home, quickly becoming a trusted family friend. "You'll be back in the field before you know it," she teased Michael one evening over dinner. "But for now, enjoy the diapers and sleepless nights." Michael laughed, something he hadn't done freely in what felt like years. "I wouldn't trade this for anything," he replied, glancing at Lisa and Grace for the sense of contentment he hadn't known he could feel. As the seasons changed, so did Michael's perspective. He knew he couldn't erase the threats that still loomed in the shadows, but he had found a way to keep moving forward. His work with the FBI had always been about protecting others, but now it carried even more weight. He wasn't just fighting for justice, he was fighting for his family, for a future where his daughter could grow up safe and unafraid. One crisp autumn evening, as Michael was tucking Grace into her crib, his phone buzzed with a message from Caroline. "We've got a lead," it read. He stared at the screen for a moment, then slipped the phone into his pocket. He kissed Grace's forehead and turned off the light. When he stepped back into the living room, Lisa was waiting for him, a knowing look on her face. "Work?" she asked. Michael nodded. "It never really stops." Lisa stood and wrapped her arms around him. "Just promise me you'll always come back to us." "I promise," he said, holding her close. As the night wore on, Michael found himself sitting by the window, staring out into the darkness. The fight was far from over, but for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel overwhelmed. He felt ready to face whatever came next, knowing he had something worth fighting for. The story of their ordeal had made headlines, inspiring countless others to stand up against corruption and injustice. But for Michael and Lisa, it wasn't about the headlines. It was about the quiet moments, the laughter, the love, the life they had built together despite everything. It was about Grace, whose innocent eyes reminded them every day of why they kept going. And as Michael finally turned off the lights and climbed into bed beside Lisa, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't known was possible. The road ahead might be uncertain, but together they would navigate it. One step at a time, one day at a time, they would keep moving forward. Because in the end, it wasn't about the battles they fought or the enemies they faced. It was about the people they loved and the future they were building. And that, Michael knew, was a fight worth winning.